obviously the NHS we've now moved towards the NHS mysteriously, and actually Salford Royal Hospital Trust was my hospital, so Mary, you've obviously hit the spot there. Hopefully get some marks in advance of this next question. It is true to say that for most voters the NHS is the single most important issue. And I want our panellists to focus on two issues. One is the role of the private sector in commissioning and providing care, and the other is the question of the funding of the NHS. Now, it's important to remember that the NHS is a remarkable success story. International comparisons, 2011, 2014, show that the NHS came out best of healthcare systems across the world in terms of value for money, patient access, safety, and quality of care. However, the last 4 years have been dominated by a catastrophic reorganisation, which even the Tories who drove it through acknowledge that it is catastrophic. It squandered approximately £3.5 billion of your money and wasted millions and millions of hours of clinician and managers' time that should have been spent on patient care. And David Cameron said he didn't know what it was all about. It has tripled the number of bodies managing the NHS from 160 to 440. And in fact, The Economist, not a famous left-wing rag, described the results of Lansley's reforms as a bureaucratic hell, raising administrative costs through the roof, end of quote. Now that's the past. And what we're concerned about tonight is, of course, the future. And in particular, how our panellists see the NHS being run and funded in future. Nobody wants another reorganisation. Please, although there may be important alterations in relation to bringing health and social care together, and I'm sure everybody agrees with that. We generally have to work within the structures that exist. But there are parts of the Health and Social Care Act that can be repealed without another bloody reorganisation. And the most important of these, and this is the one that the panel have got to think about, is Clause 75, that makes it mandatory to put the NHS out to competition, and which has proved hugely disruptive and is tearing the NHS apart, with the pieces being fed to the private sector. Now this has been denied, so I better give you some stats for the panel in particular to chew over. The proportion of the NHS now run privately has increased by 40% over the last 3 years, from 4.9% to 6-point-something%. So that's a 40% increase of the proportion in the private sector. A third of contracts have gone out to the private sector since Lansley's Health and Social Care Act was made live in April 2013, and 18% of elective surgeries in the private sector. And ladies and gentlemen, the pace is quickening. In March, this month alone, we have had a £5 billion contract go to Capita for running the NHS, a £700 million contract for elective surgery, and we have a £1.5 billion contract up for grabs for end-of-life and cancer care in Mid-Staffs. The Act, as you know, allowed NHS foundation trusts, which are the greater part of the NHS, to earn up to 49% of their income from private work. Well, we recently learned that UCH, a major London teaching hospital, is already earning 39% of its income from private patients. Meanwhile, the administrative costs in the NHS, dealing with all the transactions, dealing with the tendering, dealing with the invoices and so on and so forth, has increased to 16% of the budget. It was 5% in 1990 when the internal market was introduced. So, question one. Do the panellists think that privatisation, which is opposed by 84% of the electorate, privatisation should be increased, held steady, or reversed? So you've got a real choice there. So much for privatisation. What about funding? Under Labour from 2000 to 2009, NHS funding increased 4% a year. Under the coalition, as a proportion of GDP, it's fallen a bit, 8.2% to 7.9%. But it has increased in absolute terms by 1%. But the annual demand has increased by 4%. So the NHS is in real financial trouble, with most foundation trusts heading towards a deficit. And a report published yesterday said that they were anticipating the deficit for foundation trusts would reach £2.5 billion by the end of 2016. And of course, there has been an unprecedented deterioration in markers of NHS performance. For example, A&E waiting times, perhaps less important than other things, waiting for elective surgery, and I could go on, I could give you a long list. So, this is my second question. What funding will the parties give to the NHS? How will that funding be guaranteed? And how will it be raised? So there you are, two questions. One about privatisation and the other about funding. And you answer the questions in any order, but you have to answer both questions and write on both sides of the paper. Mark, I think you have to, I think it's your turn to kick off. And it's 3 minutes each.
2 minutes.
3 minutes. 3 minutes,
right,
yes,
okay.
absolutely.
Right, thank you very much, Ray. Let me say, just by way of introduction to this really big and significant issue, that I stand in front of you as a lifelong supporter of the National Health Service. My family and I, like many thousands of people, many thousands of local residents, hundreds of thousands, millions of people across the country, have had good cause to be grateful for the care and support provided by our local NHS, and I mean local NHS, over many years. So I'd be the first to pay tribute to the excellent work done by local doctors, nurses, and indeed all health staff. The question specifically about the role of the private sector, I certainly don't want to see it increase. I think that's the easiest part of the question to answer. If I might say so, I think the genie is out of the bottle about private sector involvement in the NHS in principle, and I think it will be very, very difficult, personally I think virtually impossible, to ever put the stopper back in the bottle now. That's not something that's happened over the last few years, neither has mismanagement of the NHS by politicians only happened over the last few years. It's long been an issue. I remember in the last government we had the situation where private companies were being paid, I think the figure was £250 million for operations that weren't even performed. So mismanagement is not something new. Private sector involvement has increased under this government as a percentage of national health service from 4.5% to 6%. That's a 1.5% increase by private sector.
It's a 40% increase in the baseline.
Those are not my figures, so if Ray or anybody else wants to challenge them, they're from the King's Fund. They were in the papers over the last couple of days.
Just a clarification, we've got a bit more time. It's 40% increase over the baseline.
The King's Fund have independently said the percentage of treatments carried out in the National Health Service is increased by 4.5% to 6% since the coalition came into office. But as I made clear, I don't want to see any increase in privatisation, which is one of the reasons why I've supported the Stockport NHS Watch petition calling for it to be made exempt. The coalition has put more money into the NHS. I think you're right to say, is it enough? And many people would say no. I question whether or not there'll ever be enough money for the National Health Service, however much we all might agree to make it our number one priority. People are living longer, that's a good thing. The demands on the NHS increase exponentially. But there are 13,000 more frontline staff now than there were when the coalition was first formed. And we have committed, the coalition has committed more money to the NHS. The Liberal Democrats have committed more money for the next couple of years and are the only major party, and I'll finish on this point because you did say funding was critical to the question, the only major party who has agreed with the figure set by Simon Stevens, the Chief Executive of NHS England, that £8 billion is going to be the minimum necessary to keep the NHS going by 2020. And I am quite proud that that commitment will be on the front page of our manifesto for the general election.
Thank you very much indeed. Thank you. Martin.
Thank you. Like 25 years ago, 27 years ago, I was on holiday with my wife in Austria on a skiing holiday. She didn't like my steering on a toboggan run and she decided she was going to take over. And we went off the first corner and she broke her ankle. And in the hospital, I wasn't quite sure how these things worked, whether I'd have to pay up front and claim back from the insurance and like that. And I'm sitting in the hospital waiting and thinking, I have no idea what a broken leg costs. And it just brought home to me, I thanked God for the National Health Service that I never had to worry about those things, that it was just there for me when I needed it. And it was a profound lesson to me about the importance, not as some national icon in our lives, but as an important instrument of help in everyday lives, and we have to be absolutely committed to that. Privatisation in the National Health Service, I think, is a cancer in the system of the service. And I will say, my own government, I think, went too far in allowing actually private sector engagement with the National Health Service. but it was always seen as a replacement for capacity gaps in the service. It was never seen that it was automatic for you to send every service out to tender, which is what would happen under the Health and Social Care Bill. And Mark says he's never supported wholesale privatisation, but actually Mark was the whip of his party that forced that bill through the House of Commons, which allowed every single service to go out to tender. And I'm afraid you've got to explain that one to the people of Cheadle and to the country, Mark. And I don't think you've done that tonight. Our party is committed to actually saying that we must go back on the level of privatisation. Yes, we can use the private sector where there is a fundamental capacity gap, either be it in a short term or because of a geographical gap, but we will build into the National Health Service a statutory requirement that NHS publicly funded provision is the automatic preferred provider in every single case. And I personally think that ought to be the absolute commitment to the National Health Service. In terms of funding, we are committed to finding extra funding for the National Health Service. We're clear about where that's going to come from. We are going to tax mansions, which are worth over £2 million. We are going to introduce a levy on tobacco, and we are going to take advantage actually of a piece of legislation that the government passed on general avoidance of tax to start saying, let's enforce it now if you've got that provision in there, and let's use the money raised from, for example, stopping hedge funds avoiding stamp duty to actually pay for health service. Let's take the money which we expect to be used for public services from those who are simply feathering their own pockets with it and put it into the services necessary for ordinary people. So let's roll back on privatisation. Let's keep the spirit of the National Health Service as we stand below the founder of it, Nyron Bevan. Let's make the funding available to actually do that, and let's expand the capacity of nurses and doctors and care workers to make it a reality in the lives of people.
And we can take for granted you love the health service, so we can be assured you love it. We're just particularly focusing on the two questions.
I think when you love something, you can't say it often enough. And we do. I think we're probably all agreed on that in this room. And it's a really difficult debate because we acknowledge that we all love and want to protect and value the health service, the National Health Service. And yet, when we look back, and we have to look back, because part of what you do in the future is based on the past. And when we look back, prior to the last general election, we pledged to ring-fence it, and we will ring-fence it again. We've put more money into the National Health Service, 12.9 billion over those years. We set up the Cancer Drugs Fund, such was our commitment to that. So the way we've acted in office should actually give some consolation to and encouragement to you when we're looking at the future. One thing that I just do want to touch on, and it is what do we mean, we talked about what do we mean by the NHS, and we had a discussion about that. But maybe we should also say what do we mean by the private sector. And I think that is something that's also worth exploring. Is it the people who come in and clean the hospitals? Is it those staff? Is it the master call which we have in Stockport, which does such a great job? Are we talking about social enterprise? Are we talking about community interest groups? It can cover quite a wide range, so I think we need to be clear about what we mean by the private sector. It's right, I mean, the figures that I had for under the Labour government were 5% privatisation, and it's now 6%. It seems to be accepted that it has slowed in its rate over the past 5 years. And those are the figures that I've got. So if we're looking at different sets of figures, I'll accept the mean and say 4.5 to 6. But still those 4.5 were under the previous government. And there was a commitment that they had to the privatisation, the private sector, where it could help the NHS. And I think that's a reasonable one. But I think we need to be clear about what we want the private sector to do. Because ultimately, it's got to be doing something that is for the benefit of us and our families and our children. I've got 4 children, all born in the NHS, or received treatment on it. So, from my point of view, there should be no lack of any views that I'm committed to the NHS.
Sorry, just be a pedant about the question. The question was, will you Will privatisation increase if you had your way? Would it remain the same? Would it become less?
Well, I don't think it's going to be about me having my way. It's about it's about the clinical commissioning groups deciding what's best for the people that they serve. So I would like them to be making those decisions and making those decisions in the best interest of the people of Cheadle. And that seems to be a fair assumption that your doctor is going to make the best decisions for you, and that's where I would start from. In terms of funding the NHS, to me it seems like an obvious one. We can't fund the NHS if we don't have a strong economy. And so growing our economy, putting in place all the things that we need to do to make sure that we've got a growing economy is the surest way that we can say that we are going to have a strong national health service. Because if our economy fails, if we are left in a situation where there is a note in a drawer saying there's no money left, we're not going to have a strong national health service. So my plea would be to say we have to accept that we need to grow our economy, we need to have a strong economy in this country to pay for a strong national health service.
Thank you. John.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. The question was, do I believe that privatisation should be increased, held steady or reversed? I believe it should be reversed. First of all, privatisation does not improve the standard of services. We've heard earlier from Bridget, I think it was, about the takeover by the Arriva Bus Company of the non-emergency ambulance services in the North West. And the Manchester Evening News revealed in an article last October that Arriva had failed to meet its performance targets for 6 successive months after it took over that contract. And no wonder it did, because it won the contract by saying it could perform the job cheaper and still make a profit. And that's the myth of privatisation. Another indication in recent months of the failure of privatisation is the fact that the Hinchinbrook Hospital, the only hospital in England totally privatised, everything privatised, the company there, Circle, has handed the contract back immediately before a damning report was about to be published by the Care Quality Commission. So another massive failure of privatisation. The threat of privatisation as well, I think, is enormous. One thing that disturbed me when I read about it recently was the latest government pilot scheme for the issuing of fit notes for people who are off sick for longer than 4 weeks. GPs are to be encouraged to hive off to Maximus, the same company that took over from Atos in persecuting sick and disabled people on behalf of the DWP to force them off the benefits they're entitled to. GPs will be encouraged to hive off to Atos, the administration of the renewal of fit notes for anybody who's off ill for more than 4 weeks. So that shows you what's planned. And no wonder this is happening. Unite Union did a survey of 3,392 CCG board members earlier this year and found that 513 of them were directors of private healthcare companies. 140 of them owned such businesses. 105 of them carried out external work for private healthcare companies, and 400 of the CCG board members were shareholders in private health companies.
John, you're just reaching near the end of time. The second question was just about funding, a very quick
answer.
Yeah,
funding, yes. We believe that the NHS should be funded wholly through taxation, and we believe that taxation should be raised by a heavily progressive income tax, by wealth tax, by increasing corporation taxes. Corporation tax is still 35% in the USA, by the way. The heart of the capitalist beast doesn't believe that you have to reduce corporation tax to 20% and below. By boosting the resources of the HMRC to end tax evasion and close loopholes and close tax havens. By scrapping Trident, which would pay for A&E services for 40 years.
Thank you very much. And there's 2 questions. More privatisation, less privatisation, or leaving it as is, and funding.
My views, I fully support where we are with the NHS. And again, I thank Stephen Hill because 2 years ago they saved Kerry's life, my wife, when she nearly died of malaria. So I'm a little bit against them trying to close down the A&E wards there at the moment. However, no, I don't believe that privatisation should increase at all within the NHS. Now, from our side, funding, we've got funding plans. It should be fully tax paid. However, we do have at the moment, and it has been stated, £2 billion of the NHS budget is being lost to health tourism, whether we like it or not. So as you know, what we would like is people who come to this country to actually have a private health insurance before they come here, just like we have to when we go to America and Australia, so that they can afford, if they get ill, they don't pop into our hospitals and use money that could be for your grandma's spare hip or eye replacement or anything else. The other thing that we like to do is, if we manage to get out of the EU, which we believe in, is the money that we would save from both the EU subscription and the development aid budget, a massive chunk of that, we would be able to put £3 billion extra into the NHS. Now currently, according to Louise Bors, our NHS spokesman, the £3 billion at current rates would pay for 8,000 more GPs, 20,000 more nurses, and 3,000 more midwives. Now, I came to the clinical meeting that they had about making super hospitals in Manchester a few months ago now. Now, Dr. Ranjit Gill had a very, very good point. He said, it doesn't matter how much you put in the NHS now, it will not fix the problem in time. He said it goes back to 2 previous administrations, back to the mid-90s, when the funding was cut, tuition fees went up, and people stopped basically going through the education system to become doctors and nurses. And he said, to get to the standard now, I think it takes 15 years, that's what you're looking at. You know Parliament's 5 years. If that's what you want, you are looking 3 parliaments away, no matter what gets put in now, before you will see a return on that money, if you want people in our education systems and our youngsters to go through.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Gary.
Thank you. On privatisation, the Green Party is committed to phasing out privatisation and the internal market in the National Health Service. The Green Member of Parliament, Caroline Lucas, presented a bill to that effect quite recently, and I support that. For a lot of reasons. For example, if you privatise different little bits of the health service, it becomes fragmented, and there's always a danger that people with complex health problems are going to find it difficult to move from one place to another and are going to fall through the gaps in provision. But the main reason for me is the ethos. I've worked and studied in lots of different places in my lifetime. Everyone has an ethos, a different one, a good one, a bad one. The leader has to maintain or change the ethos. People who come into the organisation are shaped by it. The ethos I want in the National Health Service is doctors and nurses committed to caring for their patients, putting the patient first. It is a calling to be a doctor or a nurse, and we have a duty to be grateful to those people, to respect and value their contribution and what they do, and to respect the decision of the pay review body, for example. The fact that it is a calling does not mean that they should not be properly and adequately paid. On the question of funding, the Green Party policy, I understand the manifesto will suggest that there needs to be an immediate increase in NHS funding of some £12 billion, and thereafter an annual increase of something like 1% in real terms to cope with an ageing population. The Green Party would increase provision in that some things like eye tests, dentistry, chiropody, social care would become free because the NHS is important to us. Some of that would be financed by things like an increase in the tax on alcohol and tobacco, but some at the end of the day would come from an increase in general taxation, And as long as that does not put the burden too much on people who are lower paid, I think that's good. To pay taxes for something that is important to all of us, as long as that money is well and responsibly spent, is something which is good and something which we should not begrudge.
Thank you very much indeed. I'm very grateful to the panel for two reasons. One is we've had a genuine spread of views, and the other is you all kept your time, so we've got 6 minutes to give you more trouble as much as we can. And I'm going to summarise what I think of the views of each of the panel. Mark, I think you're very clear about wanting no further increase in privatisation, and you've clearly, your party's committed a very large sum of money, £8 billion, to supporting the NHS. But my question for you is, would you therefore stop the instrument of privatisation, namely repealing Section 75 of the Health and Social Care Act?
In short, I would be very sympathetic to that. We've already committed to a review of the Health and Social Care Act in the next Parliament. I happen to be very sympathetic personally to having a Royal Commission set up actually to look at long-term funding options for the NHS, because I think these are huge big issues which we would be better to address as a society outside almost of the party political spectrum.
But Labour's going to have an emergency bill because the NHS is melting like a polar ice cap at the moment, and I wonder whether you would support an emergency bill.
I think I would.
Thank you. Martin, you're clearly against privatisation. You're going to repeal the Section 75. Your sources of funding, I guess, first of all, your funding you're offered is not as generous, as far as I understand in your manifesto, as the Lib Dems.
Well, two things. One is I'd like to actually know where the £1 million is coming from. Ours is fully costed. I haven't seen that commitment yet from the Liberal Democrats. So we can promise whatever funding we want. Now we've been assured we're going to get that detail. I await it with bated breath. And the second thing is, actually, I think we assume incremental costs in healthcare provision. And I'm not sure that we should actually be looking at that. I have some sympathy with Mark's suggestion about a Royal Commission, because actually I think we should be looking at the role of primary care actually in offsetting future crisis clinical costs, because actually I think it's crisis intervention which is the most costly of all, and I don't think we've done enough yet on the primary care for people, which actually I think is better in principle and actually is probably cheaper in the long run as well.
And that's probably a convergence of views of many parties. I agree with you on that. Mary, I still didn't get a clear view about your concern about the fact that privatisation is actually tearing the NHS apart at the moment. You seemed as if privatisation was something that probably was okay, it was part of the mix and so on. And let me just correct a figure. Mark, you and I were disputing figures. The percentage increase is basically from the baseline of 4.5%. It is increased by 40% from that baseline. In other words, it's gone up to 6.5%, which is a 40% increase. That's a mathematical figure, and it just indicates the pace. But Mary, you seem to be fairly relaxed about that and would envisage a future of further and further privatisation.
Well, not at all. I don't think that there is going to be a stage where we're going to have further and further privatisation. It seems to be that the argument which should be one of consensus is one of polemic. It's either, as you describe it, further and further privatisation, or it's stop it and reverse it. If we are going to accept the premise that it was 4.5% of privatisation prior to 2010, and it's 6% now, it clearly has not got to the stage where it has been running away at a massive level.
I don't think it's caught up in this, but the evidence is the curve's going up. And if you extrapolated for 10 years, you'd have no NHS. And I'm hoping to live for 10 years, and I don't want to outlive the NHS.
I hope you live for 10 years as well, and I hope that you live to see that we've got a safe NHS.
Thank you. John, you're clearly opposed to privatisation. In terms of for all sorts of value-based reasons, I suspect rather Gary is as well. In terms of looking at the mathematics of an inevitable, probably 4% increase per annum for the demand made on the NHS, I mean, has your party thought through the mathematics and the sums?
No, we haven't. And I'll tell you why. We're a new party, we're a very small party, we don't have the infrastructure that my colleagues on the right have, researchers, ministerial positions, etc. We talk in general terms. It took Syriza 10 years to come from nothing to taking governmental power in Greece, so I reckon that 10 years is about our objective.
But in the meantime, you can
before
steal
we
some
form
ideas.
a government, in the meantime, we talk about general principles that democracy should be governed by the people, for the people, that it's based on democratic assessment of people's needs, that it's needs driven. It's not about being told from above what we can't have.
Fine, thank you.
We will assess the needs and we will democratically decide on the means to raise the funding necessary.
You're a work in progress.
Yes,
Absolutely. So, Sean, basically you're against privatisation, but Paul Nutt is very much in favour of privatisation. I believe you're in the same party.
Well, we don't have a whip, so we don't. We all have. That was his personal view. That's not the party.
He's not a minor player. He's number 2.
I understand that, but that was at the time. That was a personal view a few years ago.
Right. Fine. Okay. It's good to know, and we'll be able to track his views. Will we? With
I'm sure.
that's good to know. That's fine. Thank you. I think, Gary, you're clearly against privatisation. Again, very much on value based. The figure of 12 billion, I didn't quite track. I just wanted to know you on that. 12 billion. Where did that figure come from, and what is it exactly relating to?
That would be an increase on spending on the National Health Service.
Which not only is necessary, but you would be committed to,
Yes.
from all the sources you've described.
Yes.
Fine.
To fund hospitals and GPs better, but also to fund those additional things that I mentioned.
Absolutely. Yes. Well, I have to say, ladies and gentlemen, we've had an extraordinarily good debate, and thank you both, all of you, rather, for